Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Greetings from our SAIS Europe campus in Bologna. I am Liesl Hintz. I am an assistant professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and I'm also the co-director along with Nargis Bajoli of the Media and Politics Initiative here at SAIS. Watching in horror and devastation, watching in horror and grief the devastation of the earthquakes in Syria and Turkey, where the official death toll now stands at over 50,000 humans, but we know that numbers are much higher than that, given that there are those who have not been recovered yet. As we're watching this and watching the politics of the numbers of people that are affected and the demographics of the people that are affected, watching the politicization of search and rescue efforts, of aid efforts, and watching this role of social media in all of those dynamics. We at the Media and Politics Initiative wanted to put on an event to provide deep insights from deeply informed experts to be able to share with you. And I'm very happy to partner with the SAIS MENA Club and the SAIS Europe and Eurasia Club, who have been engaged in their own information awareness raising and fundraising efforts as well. So we really want to thank them for their support of this event and for contributing to the tech run of this. So thank you so much for joining us. To discuss these issues, we have, as I said, a deeply informed panel of experts today. We have Turulcan Elmas, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Indiana University Bloomington's Observatory on Social Media. We have Rene Khoury, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and who's working on a book project on the politicization of aid in the region. And we also have Harun Ercan, who is a PhD candidate at the State University of New York, Binghamton, in political sociology, and he also is or has served as an advisor to the co-mayors of Diyarbakir, which is one of the regions that has been affected in this catastrophe. So what I thought would be useful as we have this discussion, we'll have sort of a conversation that I'll moderate. Please go ahead and put any questions that you have in the YouTube chat, and we'll have time for those questions as we near the end. We have 60 minutes, so we should be able to fit in quite a lot. What I thought we would do is sort of start off with a brief picture of what the response to these disasters has been. What have the search and rescue and aid efforts looked like? And what have been some of the sort of challenges to those efforts? So I thought I would start with Harun Ercan. If you can give us some insight into the Turkey case, what did those aid efforts look like, search and rescue efforts look like, and what were some of the complicating factors? And then we'll turn to Rena for the Syria case. Harun?
Hi, everyone. I think it would be quite impossible to understand what's going on in Turkey without making something clear at first. It is the fact that the government and Erdogan saw this disaster as a political emergency rather than a humanitarian one. I think without making this clear, it's almost impossible to understand his moves. Certain actions that sounds extremely cruel, like obstructing aid for weeks. It has been more than 3 weeks. Many people in the affected area still are screaming for tents. There are too many scandals are coming out in Turkey right now. So first, I would like to kind of analyze last 10 for briefly what happened in last 10 years in Turkey. And I will then analyze, try to show why Erdogan is acting in that precisely in that way. And I think the Erdogan has a precise playbook for emergencies, and this playbook was formed in what happened in last 10 years of Turkey. And one of the things we need to make clear is as follows: Turkey has witnessed 2 uprisings in last 10 years. An urban warfare in 2015 and 16, and failed military coup attempt, and also from 2016 to 19, 3 cross-border military operations launched in Syria. So people in Turkey are quite accustomed to political emergencies, and Erdogan has formulated a precise playbook for what to do in such cases. However, when we look at how the government has been acting in public emergencies, let's say, like what the government did during the pandemic, what they did during the kind of wildfires in the summer of 2020 to 2022. We see that he actually kind of used a similar set of tactics to respond to humanitarian or environmental crisis. So this, I think we should also recognize the fact that Turkish government has mainly channeled its resources to bolster coercive state institutions, while also at the expense of those performing non-coercive functions. Like why military, intelligence, police received quite high amounts of funding and support from the government. On the other hand, agencies which are in charge of disaster management, like the agencies who are in charge of health and education, they have been quite weakened in the last 10 years. So many discussions around Turkey, as we know, scholar discussions usually revolve around the regime change in Turkey. But I think we all scholars right now are witnessing something that they missed. We did not pay enough attention to what was happening within the state institutions in the last 10 years. And I think that's why it is much harder for us to understand what's happening in the last 3 weeks. So let me turn back to the disaster response. I think from the moment that Erdogan heard about the extent of devastation, he started to consider this as a political emergency. And he knew that the government would not be able to deal with this in such a huge disaster. And then the second thing I believe, as he did previously, was thinking about some ways to prevent the opposition from garnering popular support. I think Erdogan considers these emergencies, regardless of the underlying cause of the emergency, as a phase of political competition for legitimacy. And he knows that also by looking at the history of Turkey, how AKP came into power after the 1999 earthquake. Erdogan knows that failed state efforts usually create a crisis of legitimacy, and this might lead to meaningful political change. So therefore, what he did was thinking about ways to limit the opposition from scoring points. That was one of the first things that he told. But I don't think he was expecting for civil society in Turkey to quickly get organized and use social media effectively and develop a unprecedented response to this unprecedented disaster. And of course, with the support of the international community, we should also be thankful for that. That probably Tuğrulcan is going to reflect on this more, but that's why just in the second day of the disaster, Erdogan tried to restrict people's access to Twitter and TikTok. Although, it's hard to really believe and hard to imagine people on the rubble or stuck on the rubble, tweeting, trying to make their voice heard by others, as screaming for help on Twitter. And the government is blocking people's access to blocking access, and this is hard to imagine, but this is what happened in Turkey. So to make sense of this a series of cruel efforts that Erdogan has been putting forth, I think that we can only understand Erdogan's playbook if we also take into consideration that Erdogan had also another thing in his mind when he heard about the disaster. What's going to happen afterwards? He thought about rebuilding quickly. And in last 2 weeks, Erdogan has been using most of his time to making necessary arrangements to start rebuilding in the quake hit areas. So I will kind of come back to this point, maybe kind of in next rounds. But I can say that without considering this as a kind of without kind of considering that Erdogan did not consider primarily this as a humanitarian disaster, but as a political disaster, it's hard to make sense of what's happening in Turkey.
I think that's a really nice encapsulation of this as a political disaster, and not just in terms of the response, but in terms of who was vulnerable, and in terms of how many buildings collapsed, and in terms of how much construction that wasn't carried out under the kinds of permits that would ensure that those buildings are safe, and the ways in which the political elites were able to benefit from that. I think there's a lot of politics baked into this, so I really appreciate you encapsulating that. I do want to return to the question of sort of local actors in terms of the civil society response that you talked about. And I know that you've worked a lot in local politics, so I want to return to that. But Rene, I want to move on to you and sort of ask you what this looks like in the Syria case. We have a number of complicating factors there in terms of territorial control that are sort of shaping that. And I know you've followed this closely. So can you give us kind of a sense of what those dynamics look like?
Yes, and thank you for hosting us, both to the student organizations and to you, Dr. Hens. And I've already learned so much from Harun, so thanks for making me part of this conversation. Like Harun, I'm also going to go back, 10 or so years in the Syrian context, because Syria has been in a humanitarian and political emergency over the last 12 years, beginning with the 2011 uprising that was part of the Arab Spring or Arab uprisings in the Middle East. And since that time, given the repression and the escalation of violence in the Syrian context, there have been severe fissures and cleavages that have translated to the aid landscape in Syria. So that has meant that, within the Syrian government, in its effort to maintain its power, facing this popular uprising, prevented aid organizations from reaching communities in need, either in areas besieged by the Syrian regime or in opposition strongholds. And it took several years for international aid organizations to figure out a formal solution to these blockages of aid, so that eventually in 2014, the UN Security Council agreed on a resolution that enabled formally cross-border passages of aid from border crossings in Turkey and as well as in Jordan. And those were to reach areas that were primarily rebel held by armed groups in the Syrian conflict context. At the same time, they continued to deliver aid through Damascus into government-held territory. So you've had this big division in the aid-based response. Now, sort of moving up closer to the earthquake, although you have this continuous formal division in the aid-based response, it's also been increasingly squeezed as the Syrian government has imposed more control over Syrian territory and recaptured much of the country. Its allies on the Security Council, Russia and China, have managed to reduce the cross-border mechanisms, tightening those mechanisms for getting aid, especially into northwest Syria, which is where, of course, the earthquake was most felt in Syria. So, of course, the epicenter, as we know, was in Turkey, and most of the damage and casualties are in Turkey, which is also home to many Syrian refugees who were affected. But it also affected Idlib and Aleppo and Latakia and Hama inside Syria, some of those being government-held territories, some of those being rebel-held territories. So in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, northwest Syria, Idlib in particular, was aid was not reaching these spaces. There was not the search and rescue efforts conducted by either government actors or international aid agencies in Idlib. The only people who were conducting search and rescue efforts in Idlib were the local civil organizations that have emerged since the time of the uprising, including groups that are quite familiar to international community, like the Syrian Civil Defense, often known as the White Helmets, but many other grassroots organizations too. There's actually been quite a proliferation of local civil actors in the Syrian context. So they were the people responding to those populations in need until eventually the cross-border mechanism was picked up again and convoys were able to pass through. Meanwhile, in government-held territory, there has been something of a series of diplomatic victories for the Syrian regime that have been enabled by their need for humanitarian response. The regime and its supporters immediately began a discourse about ending the sanctions on Syria. There have been Western-led sanctions on the country for many years, but these became much more broad and collectively targeted in the past couple of years. And so the regime used this as an opportunity to call for an end to those sanctions. And indeed, there was an easing of the sanctions in order to better enable the humanitarian response. The humanitarian actors have been operating in this government-held territory all the while, including during the sanctions regime, but they have been restricted because the whole financial sector is restricted and aid organizations operate in a larger context, an economic context. At the same time, while those sanctions were lifted, the government-held territory were benefiting from aid sent from Arab countries like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. They were airlifting convoys into Syria, and these are countries that previously, during the course of the war, had rejected the regime's legitimacy, funded armed opposition groups. So we have seen these bridges, some of which have already been in process, built further, so that in fact, Assad made a trip to Oman in the last few weeks, taking one of his very few international trips that are not to Russia or Iran, and had visits as well from Egyptian ministers and conversations with Jordanian ministers and the like. So this has actually been quite a series of developments that seem to favor the Syrian regime. Now, that said, how much this is improving the lives of Syrians who are affected by the earthquake's repercussions is much less clear. And, even just in the few weeks since the earthquake, prices, which were already drastically inflated, have risen even further for regular civilians, regular people on the ground in Syria, including in both parts of these divided territories. People who are in Idlib and Aleppo are continuing to live in tents for now, as even the structures that have not fallen are compromised. And some of the reasons that those structures are compromised have direct association with the war, including because some of these, especially like in eastern Aleppo neighborhoods, some of these buildings were under bombardment for many years. Even if you just think of the shelling and how that can loosen the earth and the soil, as well as in places like Idlib, where there's very high population of internally displaced people. And in order to accommodate all these IDPs, there's been informal construction of housing for these large populations. So all these housing structures weren't, officially approved or, constructed according to standards that would help them withstand these kinds of natural disruptions. So there's many factors related to the conflict that have exacerbated the severity of the crisis. Of course, an earthquake would be bad under any conditions, but under the conflict conditions, it is much worse and harder for people, no matter how resilient Syrians turn out to be. This has been a very difficult crisis for them as they try to come back.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that incredibly comprehensive and concise picture of the factors. And it's really, I think, interesting and devastating to see in very different authoritarian regimes, the ways in which governments kind of seek to control and to benefit from these types of political crises, and the ways in which their various forms of authoritarian consolidation and repression of opposition, whether it's in a civil war, or whether it's through, denying opposition groups access in aid provision. I think there's a lot of lessons to learn for other authoritarian contexts as well. So I really appreciate this deep insight in these cases, and then kind of thinking about sort of the humanitarian effects of authoritarianism more broadly. So I similar to Harun, I want to return to the question of the civil society actors in the Syrian case, but I want to turn to Tuğrulcan. You're one of the people that I've been following the most on Twitter in terms of providing up-to-date and I think really insightful perspectives on the specific role that social media has been playing. So we know that social media, at least in the Turkish case, has had a coordination function, it's had an information distribution function, it has had a fundraising function, it has had a expression of opposition function. Specifically, I want to kind of narrow in on your research on hashtags, because you've been looking, I think, at really interesting dynamics of how hashtags were initially used in search and rescue efforts. So if you want to start there and then maybe address some of those other factors, whichever you like, and then we can circle back to some of the other forms of social media, the politics of that. So if you could start with hashtags, we'd love to learn more about that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for hosting me in this webinar. So my my field is computer science, and my specialty is analyzing disinformation and coordinated manipulation effort using computer science techniques. So in this disaster, I focused more on these two fields, and the first one is how computer scientists and influencers coordinated on social media to identify the victims and to organize the aids. And the second one is how the media, the ruling party, the government, or the opposition framed the disaster to shape the opinions of the public. So to begin with the first one, we've seen in this disaster that I think it may be the first of its kind, is that people were calling, tweeting, or messaging under the rubble, because some were caught some were caught when they were sleeping, and probably their telephones were there beside, so they were able to communicate. Although the internet access in the area wasn't perfect, they were still able to get help. And when you see there are an influx of people asking for help on social media, you try to help them somehow. So in the first hours of the disaster, I was also seeing these messages. I was like desperately retweeting them, and I was trying to find people that need help and giving their address and telephone numbers, and some of their tweets weren't getting enough retweets. So I was trying to find them and help them. But then I realized that this is not scalable, so we need more scalable solution. And fortunately, there were a lot of people who think of the same. So there were coordinated efforts on identifying the victims. So actually, there's a special there's a special focus on this kind of research. It's called crisis response research, and basically the question is how do we organize messages on social media into different categories so that then we can process them and get the relevant ones that we need. So so when you collect the social media posts from the platform in such a disaster, you will find millions of posts. So it's impossible to just read them and classify by yourself. And most of these are irrelevant and hard to identify the victim. So what I observed is that one solution was it was a coordinated effort of computer scientists and software engineers, is that they collected the social media posts and they extract the addresses in these posts using natural language processing techniques. Then they create the heat map to find the areas that may need help. And by heat map, I mean there are multiple social media posts that directs people to same address. So if there are a lot of such social media posts, probably there is a big problem there. So maybe the coordinate efforts can be direct to this and try to maximize the rescue operations. So this was one of these efforts. But of course, with this approach, there were a lot of problems because first, it was possible to identify the victims, but it wasn't possible to track the victims after, like if they get help already, or if they still need help. Also, and I'm not able to fact check this claim, but the ruling party and some other people claim that some of these addresses were fake and they were wasting the rescue operations or resources for rescue operations. So basically, we need more scalable techniques or more reliable techniques, also scalable techniques for future crisis. And in one case, one of the influencers that were helping the rescue operations, he tweeted that there was a dam which exploded, so it need to be taken care of because it may create danger. And he deleted his post after, I guess, half an hour or 1 hour, like very quickly. But still, a lot of people tried to help and fix the dam. But then it turned out that unfortunately, this wasn't true. So the influencer has to give a statement to the police for spreading disinformation. So this is because the government implemented a new disinformation law in 2021 or 22, like very recently, and because this was a very impactful post, although the person had very good intentions, they show this as a claim, evidence to say that this person spreads fake news. So it's very unfortunate.
Can I have a quick word about that?
Yes, of course.
I mean, when we analyze the statement of the person we're talking about, he also mentioned that he received information from the ministry. So it looks like they misinformed him, and his team spread that information through social media, and then this was used as a kind of legitimization for kind of somehow punishing him in later on. So it is also quite, I think, since I specifically also kind of study in my dissertation how the government tries to manipulate kind of opposition during emergencies. I was quite kind of closely following this issue. I think I just wanted to make that clear. Like, he received the information about the collapsing dam from the ministry. That's important.
Yes, of course. Of course, I'm not blaming him or anything. I actually would like to underline that during such crisis times, there are a lot of information. So when there are a lot of information, there will be a lot of disinformation as well, or misinformation, because the person who spreads the information may not know that it's fake news. Also, I would like to also point out that there were some cybersecurity issues, that there were fake efforts to fake organization who wanted for donations in TikTok lives and in PayPal's. So, for example, there was one campaign that asked for money to donate to the victims, and the campaign accumulated $900 on PayPal, but the $500 came from the fundraiser itself. So he donated to himself to make the organization legitimate. And I'm stressing the PayPal here because PayPal is banned in Turkey since 2016, so it's obviously inauthentic. And also, like, because there were a lot of efforts to donate to the victims, there were IBANs of, like, people were sharing IBANs of civil societies and crypto wallets, and at some point we started to observe fake IBANs and fake crypto wallets asking for donations, but the donations were going to some illegitimate people. And another unfortunate news that Harun already said is that Twitter was blocked for some time, and people start to use VPNs to access Twitter. And we also observed fake VPNs that wanted to lure people to use them so that they can steal their information. So in this long thread of thoughts, I wanted to stress that during crisis times, there's a lot of panic, and because of panic, there's a lot of information that flows everywhere, and because of that, there's a lot of disinformation and scams like this as well. And if I may, I can also comment a bit on the media and politics aspect, or we can switch if you like.
Yeah, let me just, so we got a question from the audience, from Rebecca, asking precisely about this, the blockage of Twitter and some of the other social media platforms that we've seen. Also, Ekşi Sözlük, which is a popular social media, kind of an urban dictionary in Turkey. It was another site that was blocked. I want to start with Harun and then go back to Tuğrulcan. Sort of, why do you think these sites were blocked? How does that work? When have we seen that in other cases in Turkey? If we could just kind of speak to the government intervention in social media. And then I kind of want to get back to the fundraising component and the civil society effort in Syria and Turkey. So Harun, if you could pick up on the sort of government intervention, Tuğrulcan, and then we'll go back to civil society.
Yeah, let me respond to the question first. I think the government's efforts to restrict people's access to internet started during the urban warfare in the Kurdish region, 2015 and 16. So since then, in major emergencies, government has been using this kind of quite oftenly. And right now, why government is doing this is because I think they are quite kind of unhappy with the fact that this disaster has led to a political mobilization. And they think that is going to be kind of politically costly for the government. It is kind of undermining their legitimacy, because we do not forget the fact that the Erdogan, kind of saying in the last 10 years, he has been posing as he is the leader, the regional leader, not just the Turkish leader, but the leader of the kind of Muslims in the Middle East. And that's why he has also channeled many kind of state resources for the military. I don't want to go too deep into Erdogan's kind of the way he managed things, but I think that they are quite unhappy with the fact that kind of civil society organizations are right now still working on the ground. They are providing mutual aid, they're organizing aid, and that's why not only we are talking about an online kind of repressive intervention, but what's happening on the ground is also kind of quite similar. So, for example, beginning from the last week, in Hatay specifically, the government has been trying to kind of forcibly remove those kind of aid groups which were at the quake hit areas from the day one. So they're using police force in order to enforce this. And more importantly, the governments also kind of, I think all these kind of attempts to prevent opposition-led kind of solidarity campaign boils down to the same reason, trying to kind of prevent the government from being kind of seen weak. And this is about a government who is more kind of focused on the political repercussions of the disaster rather than the humanitarian aspects or the problems on the ground right now. So that's why the all kind of aid-related problems are still and persisting, despite it has been more than 3 weeks. So this blocking social media is also related, is a kind of, let's say, an extension of this. What's happening on the ground is also happening online too. And the Erdogan is making a lot of moves in order to overcome this kind of crisis. He wants to pose as the leader who kind of rebuilds, and this earthquake disaster were too big, and any government couldn't be kind of be proficient to handle this. But we can say that the local aid organizations could try to continue to work quite effectively, despite that they are being obstructed so oftenly. Just kind of let me remind the fact that I think when you think about the local dynamics, if the government had not appointed trustees to HDP-led municipalities, the aid organization would be much more quick, much more done smoothly. There are only 2 municipalities left. These Maraş and Adıyaman, they couldn't be, because the whole infrastructure collapsed during the earthquake, and the aid could not be delivered from other kind of areas, and the only way to go to these 2 cities was going through Diyarbakır. And there's only kind of 2 municipalities left, and out of kind of 80 something, these 2 municipalities, and they made a huge difference with the HDP. And unfortunately, in the previous week, the government appointed a trustee, a district governor as a trustee, to HDP's aid kind of coordination center in Pazarcık. And right now, then they just kind of took it and gave all this kind of aid to Afad. And this is one of the major problems right now. The government does not want any other kind of organizations to kind of provide aid to people on the ground. They have monopolized this through Afad, which is the Disaster Coordination Authority of Turkey. And if I've been talking to my friends who are on the ground, since I was also in charge of overseeing what is happening in the Yazidi refugee camp in Diyarbakır. So I know a lot of rescue workers, people who have been kind of experts in disaster relief efforts. So all these people whom I was working with, they got fired after a trustee was appointed to the Diyarbakır Metropolitan Municipality. And but all of them are right now on the ground. And so I keep kind of regularly talking to them, saying what's happening on the ground. And they are, one of the things that they mention is that it is kind of really hard to deliver aid from other cities into the earthquake areas. Because like if you are bringing aid with a kind of, let's say, a truck, the government is seizing it. It's being expropriated by Afad and the police. And on the other hand, you need to kind of manipulate this, like you need to use small trucks in order to bring aid into the quake areas. So I think, I mean, the governments overall, especially after the first week, we would expect that things would get better in terms of coordination of the aid. But the government is not able to coordinate it very well. On the other hand, they are also blocking civil society organizations from delivering aid to people who are to the earthquake victims. Like 2/3 of people have already left the earthquake hit areas, but the remaining ones are the poorest segment of the society. They have nowhere else to go. So they really depend on the kind of aid to be provided by these kind of local aid organizations. So we should also be paying attention to this kind of unfortunate fact.
I really appreciate you drawing attention to the local politics of this, both in terms of the ways in which local networks and the social capital that those local networks have, the trust, can be utilized to kind of fill the gaps that the state is not able to fill. But also the social networks and the institutional knowledge that are lost when you remove these democratically elected members of the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party and you replace them with government trustees. You lose that network of being able to provide aid. So I think that dynamic is really important. Turulcan, I want to see if you want to add anything in terms of government intervention in social media, the reasons for it, the effects that has. And then also, I know that you've been writing on sort of the government manipulation of expert opinion. So if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yes, of course. So I need to clarify that I'm not from the area, so I don't have many reports from the grounds. I only read it from the social media, so I would suggest taking Harun's word for it. And so I would like to comment more on the media aspect. So first, I guess we kind of skip this very important information because we take it for granted, is that we have elections in 3 months. So that's why this disaster is politicized very much, although the government says don't politicize it, and even some opposition parties say don't politicize it. They still politicize it because somebody will criticize the parties or the government, and they have to defend themselves, and they have to like a company, they have to like do PRs and manage their reputation. Actually, that's how it works on Turkey, and because of that, the ruling party put a lot of emphasis on media and how their reputation on media. And because of this disaster, of course they get a lot of criticism, and they had to organize how will they respond to criticism, and what are their narratives about the disaster, or about the scale of the disaster, or about the relief efforts. So one thing, first of all, to talk about Twitter. So we have to understand one thing, is that the government used put a lot of emphasis on the media, and in the past 20 years, they managed to be able to control most of the mainstream media, and these media agencies that they control, they generally publish news that has similar narratives. So if you read one article from one and then turn to the other, you will see that the message is more or less the same. And because they control most of the mainstream media, there is a big bubble of there's a big opposition bubble that's mostly on Twitter. So there are also like YouTube channels and some TV channels as well, but they are most on Twitter. And because of that, the Twitter penetration in Turkey is very high. I guess like 20%. And last time I checked, there were 60 million Twitter users. And there was a recent scientific computer science article which found that 5% of Twitter is Turkish, in Turkish language. And this is more than Arabic, and this is comparable to Spanish. So and I guess one of these factors is that because the government controls most of the mainstream media, this make people to immigrate to Twitter, and it creates such a big bubble. And so because most of the people on Twitter is aligned with opposition, they create this kind of echo chamber, and like opposition voices just like flows around. Of course, there are a lot of valid criticism, but also there are some disinformation, and as well, and government, the ruling party doesn't like disinformation. Of course, they don't like criticism as well. but they cite disinformation when they block access Twitter. And also another pro-government argument is that there are a lot of criticism that says where is government, where is states, we don't get help, and they say that this make people lose credibility on the government and rescue efforts. And to some extent, it can be true. I mean, if you hear that a lot of people say we don't get help, you start to lose credibility and you start to lose hope that you will get helped. But of course, blocking is never the solution. And so, like I said, there was a disinformation law, and Twitter had to obey this disinformation law, and they had to do some procedures, and I guess they are not doing it very well, so they blocked the Twitter at that point because the impact was huge. And they talked to the Twitter administration, and then they lifted the access after a day or two. I'm not sure of the duration, but it was lifted after very shortly. However, 4 or 5 days ago, they blocked another social media platform, which is a local social media platform called Ekşi Sözlük. It looks like Urban Dictionary, but it's actually a social media platform. And this social media platform is based on Turkey. So the administration, the servers, content moderators, everyone is Turkey. So they abide the laws. And whenever there's a court ruling that says remove this content, they do it within 2 days. So they actually quit very quick. And actually, the content moderation is much stronger than Twitter, but still it's a big opposition bubble. And you see when you open up the websites, like there are a lot of entries, posts that criticize the government. So they blocked access. I mean, their argument was that during such a crisis time, there were a lot of disinformation going on, and the content moderation wasn't enough to curb on such disinformation. I mean, basically 48 hours is not enough. And in one perspective, I would say that in such a crisis, of course, no content moderation will be able to put more enough effort to suppress disinformation. But in another perspective, there were a lot of relief efforts as well. So the website was very valuable in coordinating relief efforts as well. So basically, we need more constructive solutions to curb misinformation instead of blocking. Okay, I hope this answered the question. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I want to turn to Rena because we have lots of questions about sort of fundraising on social media and the ways in which people are recommending particular NGOs, concerns about if you're using those NGOs, then that is not going to particular portions of territory. So I want to ask if you want to follow up on anything that Harun and Tuğrulcan were talking about in terms of social media and government intervention, and then kind of get your perspective on the role that some of these local actors that you mentioned have been playing in aid efforts.
Sure, thanks. Something Tuğrulcan said earlier stuck with me, where he said that in these crisis contexts, there's a lot of information, and therefore there's also going to be a lot of information and disinformation and misinformation. And I'm not a social media expert by any means, but one space in which I think of this is for the Syrian refugees who are in Turkey. There are over 3 million Syrian refugees, about 3.5 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, and many of them are congregated in these southeastern regions of the country where the earthquake struck. And Syrians are under a temporary protection status, and Turkey regulates where they can be in residence, and their residence is tied to a province. They are not permitted to leave that province or live elsewhere. And this is sort of how Turkey, manages and decentralizes to manage such a large population of refugees. So in the aftermath of the earthquake, Syrian refugees have been navigating a lot of confusing information, I think, in terms of where they could go, because if they cannot be in their buildings, that restriction on their movement becomes quite a problem. And so there have been directives that are allowing them to be temporarily in another province, but it's unclear for how long. Initially, the government said it was about 2 months, but these buildings that they were living in will not be rebuilt in 2 months. There's also this new allowance for Syrian refugees to be able to cross back into Syria. And for now, they are being told that they can return to Turkey. But that comes after years of the Turkish government suggesting that it's time for Syrians to return. And with the political tensions that hosting refugees has created in the Turkish context, that it's really unclear. And I think in the barrage of information and misinformation, unclear to the Syrians themselves what the rules are and what they will be. And if in fact, it seems about tens of thousands of Syrians have returned to Syria, for now, whether they will be able to return or whether they can stay in temporary residence in other provinces and the like. So it's a hard information environment to navigate for a vulnerable population. And I'd also add to the points that Harun was making earlier about how the Turkish government has tries to control and streamline by working through their own ministries and their own preferred organizations in response. And this has been the same in Turkish-held areas in Syria, right? Because Turkey holds control over parts of Aleppo province. And it's a very similar situation there where, Turkish ministries or Turkish organizations are the preferred actors, and international organizations are pushed or managed in a variety of ways. And this is part of, the uniqueness of such a developed country like Turkey being host to humanitarian crises that are typically taking place in the global south. And so on that point in your question, Liesl, about local organizations, as I mentioned earlier, there has been a real growth and incredible sort of professionalization of Syrian civil organizations in rebel-held areas. The White Helmets are a very clear example of this. Not every civil society organization has an Oscar-nominated documentary about them, but they are exceptional. There are lots of sort of more ordinary, but still very professionalized Syrian organizations that have emerged in the last dozen years, and they are, have been oriented toward international aid actors, or at least I argue as much in my own research, in ways that have sort of made them accessible, and we can see them as clear organizations that we can donate to, for instance, and they have good websites where we can press that donate button. And that's just not the case in government-held territory, where there has not been this comparable growth in professionalized civil society organizations. And there are a lot of civil initiatives in government-held territory, but they are not operating with the sort of the resources and the training and the capacity building that those in rebel-held territory have enjoyed. And they don't have, the independence because, of course, the Syrian regime keeps their thumb on civil society, or maybe their boot. And so it is much harder to say, oh yes, donate to this NGO in government-held territory, because they are in need as well. And so it's been much more of the initiatives and the individual level donating that we have in government held territory is really person to person. I know this family in this area, trying to raise money for them. There's been a lot of these civil initiatives and a lot of local support from Syrians associated or living in government held territory, but nothing like the more independent organizations. The Syrian Arab Red Crescent is, probably has the biggest presence in the humanitarian field in government held territory. And of course, they benefit from their relationship with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent organization. Certainly their leadership is associated with the regime, but their field workers on the ground have done a lot of excellent work there.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we've sort of come to the end, but I wanted to pick up on one of Rena's points, which I think is really important. Looking not just obviously at Syrians in Syria, but the very large number of Syrian refugees in Turkey, and thinking of the connection between those populations and social media. I think it's really important that you highlight the difficulties of that information space and the way that can be navigated, especially for vulnerable populations that have already been displaced, but also the ways in which xenophobic and racist targeting of Syrians has spread on social media. There were claims that it was Syrians who were engaging in all of the looting, and that there needs to be this kind of pushback against them. And these, of course, are feeding into, and I'm really glad that Tuğrul brought this up earlier, feeding into these narratives about Syrians that have been circulating in the election space from both the government and the opposition side in terms of how these Syrians have become politicized. So I really appreciate you drawing attention.
May I quickly reflect on this issue?
You can reflect in 60 seconds.
Okay, so I think we should not forget the fact that Erdogan actually saw the seeds of this racialized moral panic in Turkey that targeted Syrian immigrants. Those kind of videos which started to be kind of circulating on social media showed that policemen, mostly, and the soldiers in one case, they were kind of torturing Syrian immigrants and saying that we are kind of punishing those who are looting or goods of kind of earthquake victims. I think that was a way, kind of a deliberate kind of tactic of the government to divert people's attention from incompetence of the government in delivering aid. I think it was a kind of targeted campaign. And Erdogan actually, kind of without mentioning Syrians per se, but just mentioning looters, he used this to declare those earthquake areas as kind of emergency, and kind of, let's say, declare a state of emergency in the quaked areas. So in this way, I think the state has total control over this area right now. So all kind of solidarity networks can be kind of forcibly removed after some point. So I think we should not forget the fact that a government which has been seeing this as a political emergency also is kind of keep making certain moves in order to appeal to kind of widespread anti-Syrian kind of sentiments in Turkey. And I think this is kind of not only dangerous, but also we should kind of consider this kind of as an kind of horrible, unfortunate incident that should not be kind of repeated at all costs. And we should be quite kind of paying attention to the possibility of kind of repercussions in the upcoming weeks and months regarding the status of kind of Syrian migrants in Turkey.
I think it's incredibly important to point to that. I think a lot of observers had been worried about and perhaps even expecting a state of emergency in southern Turkey due to potentially another military ground incursion in northern Syria, which the government had been implicating they were going to carry out. They have turned back from that, but this obviously is a case in which they have declared a state of emergency as well. Today, Erdogan declared that elections seem to be going ahead for May 14th. We'll see if that holds. But if that's the case, that means that the state of emergency expires, I think, 1 week before the elections. But again, we'll see if that's extended or what the political implications of that are. But I think the information that we've gotten from all of you speakers, and I want to thank you so much for your participation, really is the politics of authoritarianism and the humanitarian and societal costs, the ways in which opposition actors can, or even those affected can mobilize on social media is, countered by the ways in which the government can intervene, the ways in which civil society organizations can collect aid is countered by the government's attempt to try to centralize those. So I really think the politics of authoritarianism in social media and on the ground are really important. So I want to thank all of you for joining. I want to flag everyone's attention to all of these scholars' work, in particular Rene Khouri's book project, which hopefully we'll be seeing soon on the politics of aid. I want to say büyük geçmiş olsun to everybody. If you can donate, please do. Please continue to support your colleagues and friends and students from Syria and Turkey. This is going to be a really long rebuilding and recovering effort. So please continue to pay attention and show support when you can. Thank you again to the SAIS MENA Club and the SAIS Europe and Eurasia Club for your support, and join us again for another Media and Politics initiative. Thank you so much to you all.